Introduce you to one of our last two StudentCam winners. StudentCam competition is for students in middle and high school students. This year the theme was 2008 issues, and today we're going to be talking with Alexandria Segovia. Her topic was embargo or free trade with Cuba. And then tomorrow we're going to have our grand prize winner on the show at this time, and that is Nick Poss and Scott Mitchell, and their topic was religion and politics. And so we are thrilled to introduce you now to Alexandria Segovia, the first prize middle school winner. She produced a video entitled Embargo or Free Trade with her partner Kristen Cuba. Let's watch a little bit of her video and then we'll come back and talk to her.
With Florida's presidential primary just days away, voters in the state are trying to get a last-minute feel for what they believe are key subjects during the upcoming election. With many interesting issues to debate about, there is no question that the upcoming elections will be all about who is making the best argument. Due to the large portion of Cuban immigrants residing in Florida, one key issue for voters in Florida is the candidate's current position on the imposed Cuban-U.S. embargo. The 48-year U.S. embargo on Cuba, enacted in 1962, aims to deny resources to the Castro regime by prohibiting most trade, travel, and financial transactions with Cuba. The embargo was enacted after Cuba expropriated the properties of U.S. citizens and corporations. The embargo was codified into law in 1992 with the stated purpose of bringing democracy to the Cuban people, and in fact is titled the Cuban Democracy Act. In 1996, Congress passed the Helms-Burton Act, which further restricted U.S. citizens from doing business in or with Cuba, and mandated restrictions on giving public or private assistance to any successor regime in Havana, unless and until certain claims against the Cuban government are met. In 1999, President Bill Clinton expanded the trade embargo even further by ending the practice of foreign subsidiaries of the U.S. companies trading with Cuba in dollar amounts totaling more than $700 million a year. At the present time, the embargo that limits American businesses from trading or conducting business with Cuban interests is still in effect, making it one of the few times in history that U.S. citizens have been restricted from doing business abroad, and is the most enduring trade embargo in modern history. Despite the existence of the embargo, it is worth noting that not all commerce from the United States to Cuba is restricted, as the United States is the 7th largest exporter of food to Cuba, mainly in the form of aid.
Cuba's regime uses the U.S. embargo as a scapegoat for Cuba's miseries. Yet presidents of both our political parties have long understood that the source of Cuba's suffering is not the embargo, but the communist system. They know that trade with the Cuban government would not help the Cuban people until there are major changes to Cuba's political and economic system. Instead, trade with Cuba would merely enrich the elites in power and strengthen their grip. As long as the regime maintains its monopoly over the political and economic life of the Cuban people, the United States will keep the embargo in place.
As stated by the current president, who believes the embargo is being used by Castro and his followers as an excuse for Cuba's current economic situation, both political parties have, in the past, understood the need to continue with the current embargo policy. Some current presidential candidates, however, believe that the embargo is having the most negative impact on the innocent Cuban citizen living on the island. Chris Dodd believes that the embargo deprives Cubans of the bare necessities rather than debilitating the communist regime, which has proven immune to the current embargo policy over nearly the last 50 years.
Well, good morning, everyone, and let me thank all of you for coming out here this morning. My friends, every 4 years, candidates seeking the presidency of the United States rediscover Cuba. They traveled to Florida and pledged to maintain sanctions against the government of Fidel Castro until democracy flowers on the island of Cuba. Today, with the election 14 months away, the Miami pilgrimage has already begun. One of my Democratic opponents has already pledged to maintain the embargo. Another proposes to slightly change the policy. I come here today to say that the 50th anniversary of this policy will be its last. In the Dodd presidency on June 20th, 2009, America's failed Cuban policy will end, and a new era will begin. An era of greater American safety and security, an era of strength, optimism, and confidence, an era without fear. And I thank you all for listening this morning.
In Miami-Dade, where the Cuban-American voter has strong ties to the subject, such words have not been welcomed and the voters have not been shy about it.
Better ambassadors for freedom than Cuban Americans. And the money they send to Cuba can help make their families less dependent on gas overseas. That's why when I'm president, I'll grant Cuban Americans unrestricted rights to visit family and send remittances to the island. Because that's the way to bring about real change in Cuba.
On your screen is Alexandria Segovia joining us from Miami. She is our first prize middle school winner, along with her partner Kristen Cuba, who did a video on the Cuban embargo. Alexandria, how did you come up with this topic?
Well, Kristen and I came up with a list of issues that were important to the campaign 2008. So among those issues were the Fair Tax Act, the Cuban embargo, and other issues like that. So we consulted with our advisor, and we eventually came up with the Cuban embargo, that we would do the video on the Cuban embargo.
Alexandria, it was mentioned in some stories that I read that you and Kristen have family ties to the situation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, my mom, she actually came from Cuba when she was about 15. She would tell me stories that she was like beaten up when she would go to school because everyone hated her for leaving the country. And it was a really bad situation. My father came when he was about 4. And then Kristen's parents came when they were very young. Kristen's mom was like 40 days old. And Kristen's dad, I'm not sure, but it was when he was very young. Well, he was born here.
And what did you learn? What did you learn after doing this video and taking on this project?
Well, we learned a lot of stuff about Cuba, like the embargo and the history of the embargo. We also learned more about the political candidates, their views on the embargo, and things like that.
We want to get our viewers involved in this discussion with Alexandria. I'm going to give you the phone numbers, and we'll get to your phone calls here in just a little bit, but we're going to do the phone lines a little bit different this morning. 18 and under, please call 202-737-0001, and all others, please dial 202-737-0002. We're going to discuss this topic with Alexandria for the next 30 minutes. And we encourage those that are 18 and under to call in this morning, because we want to hear from you as well. Alexandria, let's talk about making this video. How did you do it?
Well, my dad had taught me how to use Windows Movie Maker just a short time before, so we thought we could do it on Movie Maker, and that's what we ended up using. Now, to get the clips that we used in the video, most of them were from YouTube, and a lot of some of the clips that are on there are from a C-SPAN show of Cuba. It was like a 2-hour special on Cuba. So we used a lot of clips from C-SPAN. I had to record the clips from YouTube, so I stacked up DVD cases and I put my little camera as a kind of a tripod sort of thing. So we edited it and in Windows Movie Maker, and we came up with the storyline after we did all the research, and we finished the documentary, basically.
And if you could, show us what camera you used. Do you still have that with you?
Yes, I have it with me. This is the camera I used. It's a very simple Sony CyberShot camera. It records video, so that's how we used it, and I didn't even pay for it. It was actually a gift from my grandmother.
And how did the audio work and everything? Did you have any problems?
Yes, we did have some audio problems, and that's one of the very important lessons that I learned while making this documentary. We should have had a microphone, but while we were in the radio station, WQBA, you could hear the radio. So while we were interviewing Bill McCollum, the Attorney General of Florida, the sound didn't come out too good and we weren't able to put the sound on his interview.
Well, and you mentioned that your family ties to the Cuba situation. Did your parents watch this video, and did they learn anything new from your video?
Well, yeah, my parents did learn a lot of new stuff. So did the representatives that we showed it to. They said, oh, I didn't know that. And it was really interesting how we could actually inform other people about the Cuban embargo. And I thought that was a great plus so that people know what the Cuban embargo is all about.
And beyond using video, you also interviewed people in Little Havana. Were people willing to talk to you, or was that difficult?
Well, some people were and some people weren't. A lot of people, we got the reaction like, oh, they're just kids, just do it for them, they're doing a project. Some of them didn't want to be on camera. We tried a couple police officers. They didn't want to be on camera though. And everyone basically just did go for the interview though.
And a little bit more about the first prize winner. You and your partner won $3,000. How are you going to spend the money?
Well, my half, I'm thinking about putting it toward my funds to go to a trip to Australia, because I really want to snorkel the Great Barrier Reef, and Kristen is not sure what she's going to use it for. Maybe high school tuition.
Okay, and we're going to continue talking about this with you. And before we do that, though, I would like to know, and probably our viewers want to know, what is your position on the embargo?
Well, I've always been for the embargo, but after doing this documentary, it's strengthened my view on the embargo, and I know more about it, so I can speak more confidently about the embargo and the whole topic of Cuba.
Alexandria Segovia, her video, we showed you a little bit, is 5 minutes long. Her and Kristen Cuba, it's actually 10 minutes long. We showed you about 5 minutes of it. If you want to see the entire video, go to StudentCam.org. You can watch the whole thing there and find out a little bit more of our contest. Also with Alexandria this morning is Juan Tamayo, Chief of Correspondence with the Miami Herald, and he is joining us so that we can have broaden this conversation out and talk about the politics and policy of the Cuban embargo, and we'll take your phone calls here while we talk to Mr. Tamayo. But Mr. Tamayo, let me start out first with when Alexandria and her partner made this video, it was before the transfer of power. How have things changed?
Sorry. They've changed a little bit, and I think there are some signs of a lot more changes coming along the pike. So far, most of the changes have been what some people have described as cosmetic. I wouldn't go that far. I think they've been, in and of themselves, relatively insignificant, although they point in a very significant direction overall for Cuba. The basic problem in Cuba is economics. The economy is in chaos. And what the main changes that should be coming along are sort of easing up of the economy, and we've seen some signs of that starting, particularly in the agriculture field, but not a lot. So far it's a lot of promise and not much actual reality.
And here's a headline from the Miami Herald. It says, opponents may begin to whittle away at the sanctions. This is from March 21st, 2008. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a sense that depending on what happens in the elections in November, there might be, come 2009, a fairly coordinated and strong effort to ease or relax some of the restrictions on Cuba. I don't believe that would cover the embargo. I think the embargo is to most people. The embargo is a kind of a symbolic issue right now, and I don't think that there will be any immediate sort of attack on the embargo, but there's a lot of restrictions on the edges of the embargo, such as the restrictions on travel, restrictions on remittances. people-to-people contacts, academic trips to Cuba, and Cuban trips to the United States. Those kinds of things, I think, there will become under attack if there is a Democratic president elected. It will be a little tougher if there's a Republican elected. So far, I think, over the last 8 years, President Bush has really kind of held the line against any attempt to really ease the restrictions, and in fact has tightened them. And he has threatened to veto any effort to ease the sanctions. And so that has stopped any kind of effort to ease the sanctions. I think under a new administration, especially a Democratic one, that would change a lot. And especially under a Barack Obama administration, he's been very public in saying that he favors a much more active engagement with the Cuban government.
Where's the debate on this issue in Congress?
It is not a very active issue right now. When the Democrats took over Congress 2 years ago, we all expected to see some heavy-duty attacks on the restrictions. There were a few proposals, and in fact, they all kind of petered away. It was never clear why the Democrats could not gather enough sort of momentum to ease some of these restrictions. But the fact is that one by one they were voted down by fairly hefty margins. So it was a surprise that the few efforts that were made were defeated pretty strongly.
And before we get to phone calls, Mr. Tamayo, do you have any personal connections with this debate?
Well, I was born in Cuba and raised in the United States, so I guess I do.
And what's your opinion on it? Do you have one?
Well, as a journalist, I keep those to myself.
Okay. And our first phone call here comes from Wilton, New York, on our line for 18 and older. All others, let me just tell the phone lines again to all of you. 18 and under, please dial 202-737-0001, and all others, 202-737-0002. We want to hear from students this morning, so please dial in. First phone call, Wilton, New York. Go ahead.
Good morning. Actually asked her the question I was going to ask, if she was for or against it. And my personal view is I really don't understand it, because I think we look like hypocrites the way we conduct this. We do all this business with China, and they're getting rich off of trading with us, and they're pretty much, my cat died last year from poisoned cat food. We don't do any trade embargoes on them, and they're beating monks. They throw people. They pretty much are the most brutal regime around. And to me, this is just like a political folly. I just don't understand. If we won't buy their sugar and cigars, but we'll fill the Walmarts with China stuff. And it's two-faced. I mean, if you're going to take a line, you have to stand on a line. But we have to open up trade with those people. If anything, I believe we're hurting them. I mean, they should get a piece of the action. They're 90 miles away. The reason they're poor, basically, is we cut them off in a lot of ways. And personally, I don't understand it. I don't see how we can deal with these other countries and treat Cuba this way. To me.
Thanks, caller. Alexandria, when you did your interviews, did you find that people understood the issue? Or was there some confusion there?
Well, there were some people who did not know what the Cuban embargo was about, and they didn't know that the United States had a Cuban embargo on it. So some people were confused, but for the most part, everyone else knew what it was about and could answer our questions.
And Juan, where does this issue rate with the American public? We have an upcoming election, and you mentioned the candidates, what they have said on the issue, but where does it rate among the several issues that are important to voters?
I think overall for the United States, for Americans, it's not a great issue. It is almost a symbol. The last caller was sort of reflective of that. we do business with China, why don't we do business with Cuba? The fact is that we do business with Cuba. In last year, the U.S. Agricultural producers sold something like $400 million worth of food to Cuba. There are exemptions to medicines being sent, and so the realities is very complex. To me, the embargo is a kind of a historical issue. It was put on in the early 1960s, I believe in 61 or 62. And it's been there for a long time, and sort of, it's a historical icon. Nobody wants to touch it because right now I think the idea is that the embargo is a negotiating tool with the new Cuban government. But there's just a lot of misunderstanding about what the embargo is and what it means.
This is a question for both of you. Juan, do you find that younger Cubans feel differently than older Cubans about the embargo?
Well, I think in general that's probably true, although I think that more generally almost every Cuban feels slightly different about the issue, in the sense that there are older people who say the embargo is not worth it, and there are younger people who think the embargo is on the nose. So there's a great, much more sort of breadth of thinking in the Cuban exile community than most Americans realize.
Alexandria, what are your thoughts on that? When you've talked to your friends, do you find that they feel differently than your parents?
Yeah, my friends, they do feel a little less loose about it. My parents have a much stronger opinion than people my age, but I do think that people will start to realize, like people my age will start to realize how important that is to our future, because we don't know what's going to happen with Cuba in the years to come.
Okay, our next phone call, Delray, Florida, on our line for 18 and under. Good morning.
Good morning. I was wanting to know, would it benefit Cuban people or the government if the embargo is lifted?
Juan, why don't you take that one? Would it benefit the Cuban people?
I think that that's a hard one to answer, because again the issue is so complex. Would it benefit the Cuban people? In a sense, you could say that it might, because if you lift the embargo, the Cuban government may feel slightly less required to sort of repress its own people. The Cuban government's explanation for its political repression is that there is a big enemy to the north, and therefore we have to be careful. Therefore, if you remove that argument, one could argue it might benefit the Cuban people. On the other hand, those kind of arguments are kind of hard to buy. The Cuban government has its own reasons for doing its own things, and we always tend to underestimate the Cuban government's own sort of goals. And the Cuban government's goals are to stay in power and to keep in place a system that is, ruled by the Communist Party, and it's a totalitarian system. Why they would be interested in easing up on any of those sort of tenets of the revolution would be, they wouldn't be there whether or not the embargo was in place or not.
And how does the embargo benefit the Cuban leaders?
Well, it gives them a very good excuse to continue sort of controlling their people. That's one argument that you hear all the time, and I don't argue with that. I think that's a legitimate argument. It gives them an excuse to control the country. On the other hand, it is an excuse. They have their own reasons for controlling the country.
Miami, Florida, on our line for all others. Good morning.
Good morning. Hello?
You're on the air, Miami.
Yeah. Listen, I am very much agree with Mr. Tamayo, his opinion. And then I'm going to add something about it, that this is my opinion is referred to the embargo. Let's say that tomorrow the United States of America is going to lift the embargo. That would be wonderful, that we can go in and out, that we can trade and this and that. But that is not good for the politicians and the people who have business, the Cubans who have business over here for 50 years, right? Because those are the ones who never wanted to be, you know what I mean, relationship with Cuba and to live the embargo. Embargo will be good for nothing. Has got nothing to Cuba because there is Cuba, Cuba has power, there is Castro, there is his brother, everything is the same. So if the Americans lift the embargo to Cuba, we're going to have a lot of visits, and this is really going to damage the Cuban government, because if we don't have any obstacle to go to Cuba and do over there, you know, what they want to do, make some business and go in and out, billions of Americans going to America to Cuba. That would be wonderful. And then the Cuban people have been suffering and suffering so much for 50 years while we have been living like kings over here, and we don't have any problem with our children.
Next caller, I'm going to leave it there. Mr. Tamayo, your thoughts?
You know, the argument, you know, you could see it 10 different ways. One of the other arguments is that if you lift the embargo, if you lift all the restrictions on travel and remittances, etc., let's say that you now have, you know, 200,000 Americans going over to Cuba to visit. You have a bunch of, you know, mailmen from Kansas City walking around Havana in shorts and tropical shirts, taking pictures. What could be more subversive to the government that kind of presence in Cuba? It's just very difficult to argue this point. There are many sort of ways to look at it. I think if the embargo were lifted, you would certainly see U.S. investments in Cuba. I'm not sure that Cuba would open its doors widely to U.S. investments. They would still regard the United States as a potential enemy, and certainly perhaps won't want to be sort of dominated by U.S. investments in the long run. So Cuba, the embargo ends, Cuba may not throw its doors open either.
Okay, our next phone call, Scituate, Maine, on our line for 18 and under.
Hi. I just wanted to, you know, congratulate you that, you know, you're not falling into the stereotype that teenagers are apathetic, because that's like a widely accepted stereotype. But anyways, I just wanted to know why you got involved with, you know, the Cuban embargo in general, because, like, it's such a random thing, and it's great to get involved with anything, but, you know, I just wanted to know what it was exactly.
Alexandria?
We as Cubans, because I'm Cuban myself, but I wasn't born in Cuba, I have a strong sense of nationalism to Cuba, but, like, it's important to me, Cuba's future, and I think the United States should try its best to help Cuba out, not by lifting the embargo, but maybe encouraging change in Cuba by not trading with them. So I just think it's an important issue to me and my family as well.
Alexandria, talk a little bit about your participation in school and different things like student council and things like that.
Well, I'm involved in a lot of things in school. Both Kristen and I are in student council. She's the president, I'm the vice president. We're both Genesis leaders, which is our youth group for religious 7th and 8th grade. So we lead prayer services for them. We're both cheerleaders. Kristen is on the Builders Club, and she's a peer mediator. I participate a lot with Hands on Miami, which is a nonprofit volunteer organization, and I'm on their Youth Advisory Council. And that's about it.
Okay. Alexandria, did your advisor, Dennis Wardlow, get you involved in this? Did he come to you, or did you find out yourselves and come to him to get his help with this competition?
Well, my dad, every morning, he puts on C-SPAN to wake me up. So one day I heard about the competition. I was like, hey, I should do this. So I didn't want to do it by myself. So I chose a teammate, which was Kristen, and we approached Mr. Wardlow on the last day of school before spring break. So when we got up to him, he was like, "Oh, you're making me work on the last day." So we gave him a list of the topics that we thought were appropriate, and he chose one, and we ended up going with the Cuban embargo.
All right, and we should mention that their advisor, Dennis Wardlow, also won a prize of $500. Next phone call, Palm Coast, Florida, on our line for all others. Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, caller. Please go ahead with your comment.
Yes, this embargo, 50-year-old embargo, let me make some comments first. Some people pretend not to understand the effect that an embargo have on a country. Let me give the Miami folks, including the young ladies' parents who helped her make this program, is have them fill up their tank every time they need gas in West Palm Beach, in Lua, as in Hialeah. Then you would have a sense of what it means to others. Regarding the business, yes, that's in the last 4 years that we have been able to, that you have been able to purchase things here. It's a one-way deal, which nobody else in the world do. Cuba can buy food in the United States, but the United States doesn't buy an ounce of anything that Cuba produces. Regarding the other big lies, the donation. Donation is what our group and hundreds of other humanitarian groups do in the United States, but they go through the grinder to get any donation there. And let me close by asking, what would we do if any of the oil-producing countries in the world would decide to apply an oil embargo on us for 3 months, not 50 years? Thank you.
Mr. Tamayo, why don't you take his comments? Any thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure where to start. The impact of the embargo, it's for the first sort of 40 years of the revolution, it was receiving somewhere between $4 and $6 billion a year from the Soviet Union in subsidies. So the idea that the Cubans were spending extra money by having to go buy oil someplace far away. In fact, they were getting much cheaper oil from the Russians. There has been some sort of exaggeration of the amount of U.S. humanitarian aid that goes to Cuba. The U.S. government continues to say that the U.S. is the biggest humanitarian donor to Cuba, which is in fact technically correct, although most of those donations, all of those donations practically, are coming from private humanitarian groups. On the impact of the embargo, it's you know, the Cubans have put out an annual report on what they claim to be the impact of the embargo. I think it's up to about $100 billion over the last 40-some years. As you know, everybody keeps noting, however, the embargo is by the U.S. Cuba's free to trade with any other country in the world. And there are issues when you get into specific technologies, specific pieces of equipment, some of it medical, that is not available to the Cubans to purchase, at least directly from the United States. On the other hand, those kinds of equipments and technologies, etc., are available not just from other countries, but also U.S. technologies available through other countries, such as Panama. Panama is one of the greatest sort of buying centers for the Cuban government. They can go in there and buy anything they want.
On your point, Mr. Tamayo, this is the Miami Herald article from last year. Cuba oil boom may complicate U.S. embargo. As Cuba's oil potential grows, a Canadian company has disclosed plans to export the island's petroleum and set up a possible clash with the U.S. trade embargo. That was a year ago. Where do things stand now on that?
Well, the promise of oil off the northern coast of Cuba is still there. They're exploring. They have not been reporting any recent developments, any finds. I think the expectations are that it will take them at least 2 to 3 years to finish the exploration, and perhaps 5 to 8 years to get that under some sort of production. The issue, or one of the issues, is that some of these things, some of these offshore wells would be not far from the Florida coast, in Cuban territorial, in Cuban waters, but not far off the Florida coast. So there's some concern about environmental issues there, tourist issues in the sense of, if there's any spills, would it create any problems for Florida, et cetera. But Cuba does have the promise of some huge oil deposits off the north coast. We haven't seen any hard evidence. It hasn't been found yet, but I think the overall belief is that there's a lot of oil there.
A couple more phone calls here. Valdosta, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning. I got a question. Can you tell me the difference between embargo and free trade?
Mr. Tamayo?
I would think they're total opposites. The embargo, at least as it's applied to Cuba right now, is that we don't, the United States does not trade with Cuba with the exception of, and then there are a lot of exceptions. Food, medicines going to Cuba are certainly exempt. Agricultural products, not just food, but fertilizers, all kinds of agricultural things can still be sold to Cuba. Coming this way, yes, no cigars, but cultural goods are exempt. So you can go to Cuba, buy a painting, bring it back. No rum either, no other products basically, but cultural products are exempt. And a free trade, such as, let's say, the one that we have with Central America and the Dominican Republic, means that it's not just that those countries agree to accept U.S. exports without any taxes, but that we agree to accept their products without any taxes. But more than that, it sort of regularizes the issue of investments and copyright protection, those kinds of things. It creates an environment that promotes investments, basically.
Okay, our last phone call here for our guest, Clearwater, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Just tell me what is the difference between the Cuban and, between the Chinese and the Cuban, because I don't see any difference there. Why Cuba, America can deal with China, they cannot deal with Cuba?
Mr. Tamayo?
Well, again, it's difficult to answer that. There is a history of Cuba, of U.S. relations with Cuba, that includes things like the Bay of Pigs invasion, that includes things like the missile crises. There's also quite a bit of change in China. If you look at the economic model in China right now, it is quite different from what you would have in Cuba. China is not 90 miles away. And there isn't a strong exile community or Chinese exile community in the United States as there is in the United States of the Cuban exile community, and has fairly strong political power. So, and nobody has ever accused the U.S. foreign policy of being sort of realistic or rational. So I'm not sure that there is any great difference. I'm not sure it makes any difference.
Alexandria, before we let you go, just one final question for you. What has this whole experience been like for you?
Well, this experience has been great. I'm looking forward to doing it again next year. And I've learned a lot about like editing videos and just the whole video making process. I think it's a great competition for other people to get involved in, and thank you C-SPAN for providing that opportunity.
Well, Alexandria, thank you very much for participating and for joining us this morning. Juan Tamayo, also thanks to you for lending your expertise to this topic. We appreciate it.
Sure.